I caught my wife's lover taking her to the company party. I followed the two without them noticing, my mind a whirlwind, my chest burning with fury and disbelief. My heart, which used to beat calmly to the sound of routine, now writhed in irregular spasms, crushed by the weight of reality. The woman I once swore to love, who promised loyalty, was in the arms of another. The man who, until then, had been an unknown shadow, now appeared in front of me, bold enough to display it like a trophy at a public event. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a slip, it wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a blatant betrayal, an affront to my dignity. The parking lot was full, but I followed them at a distance, stepping firmly, keeping my eyes on the nauseating scene. Her dress, chosen by me on a past birthday, shaped her body perfectly, now it was paraded by another man. His laughter, which had once been my peace, was now a blow, an echo of the falsehood that inhabited his soul. And he held her by the waist, his fingers squeezing her with intimacy, a touch that he wasn't allowed, but that she accepted, gave herself to, without fear, without guilt. She was too comfortable. She had been doing this for a long time. The party music became background noise as my blood boiled. How could she? How did you have the audacity to look me in the eye every morning and say you loved me? How many times, after being in this man's arms, did he come home and lie next to me, whispering empty words of affection? How many nights did you feign tiredness, refusing my touch, while you still felt his warmth on your skin? I could have stopped there. I could have swallowed my anger, gone home and pretended not to know. But no. I am not a man to remain silent in the face of humiliation. My hands were clenched, my knuckles white from the force of the pressure. I advanced through the room, crossing a sea of unfamiliar faces and fake smiles. When I finally stopped in front of them, her breathing hitched, her eyes wide as if she saw a ghost. The lover, on the other hand, tried to hide it, a half-smile on his lips, perhaps thinking he could turn it into a harmless coincidence. But I wouldn't give him that chance. Everyone will know who you really are. Your mask will fall off. The words came out sharp, cutting, echoing among the guests who now fell silent, noticing the tension in the air. Her face lost color, her hands shook, and in that instant, I saw. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. It wasn't regret, it wasn't guilt, it was pure terror. Not because she regretted what she had done, but because she knew I had the power to destroy her. She tried to speak, tried to come up with some pathetic excuse, but her mouth opened without a sound. The lover took a step back, like the coward he was, avoiding my gaze. Was this the man she was willing to throw away her entire life for? This insignificant rat who didn't even have the courage to face me? I felt disgusted. Disgusting her. I hate him. Disgusted by my own blindness. But what I didn't know, what no one there knew, was that that night wouldn't just be about exposed betrayal. That night would mark a turning point. Something would happen there that would change everything. Something that would make my wife wish she had never cheated on me. Something that I myself did not expect, but that would come as a fatal blow, destroying any illusion that still remained. And then, just when I thought I'd seen the worst, I realized the real betrayal was yet to come. Welcome to the channel where the truth comes to light and masks fall. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the lesson is real. Betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust and leaves marks that never fade. Each narrative is a warning about the devastating consequences of disloyalty. Now, prepare. What are you about to hear will shock, engage and surprise. Take a deep breath, because this story won't be easy to forget. Daniel's eyes were lost for a moment on the office window. The city stretched out before him, lit by the cold lights of streetlights and the glow of cars moving in a continuous stream. He always liked the view from above, the feeling that he could observe everything without being noticed. He was an observer by nature, someone who liked to absorb details, capture nuances that others ignored. Perhaps it was this characteristic that led him to career success, that made him a respected professional and a trusted man within the company. But ironically, it was this very attention to detail that kept him from ignoring the discomfort that had been growing inside him over the past few months. Something was wrong, something no longer fit into the harmony of your life. But he pushed the thought away, as he did whenever he found himself questioning his reality. He stood up and ran a hand through his hair, feeling the tension built up in his body. The clock on his desk showed almost 7 in the evening. It was late, but not that late. I could have left sooner, but lately work was a refuge. The long hours at the office seemed to be the only thing that kept his mind busy, keeping away the worries that insisted on haunting him. He took a deep breath and grabbed his jacket, ready to face the traffic and head home. Home. The thought made him hesitate for a moment. The word that previously carried such a simple and welcoming meaning was now loaded with something he couldn't define. Discomfort? Distance? It was difficult to say. When he got into the car, he turned on the radio, allowing the music to fill the silence. The way home was the same as always, but this time he drove more slowly, as if he was delaying the inevitable. Not that there was anything specifically wrong. Alice was still the perfect wife. Always attentive, always affectionate, always willing to make everything seem normal. But it was exactly this excess of perfection that began to bother him. The small changes in her behavior were subtle, almost imperceptible to someone less attentive. But Daniel noticed. He always noticed. Alice was a charming woman, one of those who didn't need to work hard to attract attention. Her classic beauty and the soft way she spoke made any room feel lighter when she was present. They met in college, in one of those chance encounters that seem insignificant at the time, but end up changing everything. From the beginning, he knew he wanted to be by her side. The way she laughed, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about something she was passionate about, everything about her seemed perfect. And for a long time it was. Their marriage was solid, full of happy moments and a complicity that many envied. At least, that's what he always believed. In recent months, however, Daniel began to notice a subtle difference, something he couldn't quite name. Alice still smiled the same way, still said the same kind words, but there was a distance that wasn't there before. Small gestures that seemed rehearsed, kisses that seemed more automatic than natural. He tried to ignore it. He tried to believe that it was just a phase, that maybe the tiredness of everyday life was affecting them both. But the feeling persisted, like an ever-present shadow, haunting his thoughts even when he tried to push it away. When he arrived home, he found the living room spotless, as always. Alice liked to keep everything organized, and that was something he admired about her. The faint smell of freshly prepared dinner hung in the air, and for a moment he tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that everything was still as it had been. Alice appeared in the hallway, beautiful as always, smiling when she saw him. She came over, gave him a kiss on the cheek and asked him about his day. He responded automatically, asking about hers. The conversation continued fluidly, as it should be, but inside he still felt that latent discomfort, that question that he could never shut up: what was changing? The days passed, and the feeling only intensified. Alice seemed to be always busy, always going out for appointments that were not part of her routine before. Quick calls that ended as soon as he approached, messages read and answered with a slight smile that disappeared as soon as she realized he was watching her. Nights that were once full of conversations were now silenced by the excuse of tiredness. Daniel tried not to think too much, tried to convince himself that he was just being paranoid. But he was not a paranoid man. He was observant. And I knew something was wrong. At work, things continued as usual. He dedicated himself to the maximum, immersing himself in projects, in meetings, trying to find refuge in the routine that had always brought him security. But insecurity was now inside him, slowly eroding the certainty he had always had about his life. The doubt grew stronger every day, growing like a slowly spreading virus, taking over his thoughts even as he tried to ignore it. One night, when Alice said she had a late company meeting, Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. Something inside him prevented him from accepting the apology with the same passivity as always. He watched as she got ready, putting on a dress she hadn't worn in a while, choosing her perfume with a care that seemed excessive for a simple meeting. The details were there, screaming for him to notice. But he remained silent, just observing, absorbing every little piece of that puzzle that seemed incomplete. When Alice left, Daniel remained in the room, looking at the closed door. His heart was pounding, a growing restlessness taking over him. It was no longer just a vague suspicion, a nameless discomfort. Now it was something more concrete, something he could no longer ignore. He got up and picked up his cell phone, wondering if he should call her, ask her something trivial just to hear her voice and notice any hesitation. But he gave up. He knew that if something was going on, he wouldn't find out this way. I needed something more. I needed proof. That night he couldn't sleep. The clock ticked slowly, and every minute that passed seemed to increase the weight in his chest. When Alice returned, it was already past midnight. She entered silently, thinking he would be asleep. But Daniel was awake, lying in the darkness, listening to her every step around the house. The sound of her shoes being removed, her breathing as she approached the mirror, the way she moved with a lightness that seemed rehearsed. Everything in him screamed to do something, to ask questions directly, to confront the situation. But he didn't. He just stood there, with his eyes open in the dark, feeling the weight of a knowledge that he didn't yet have, but that was already crushing him. Daniel spent the next few days enveloped in increasing restlessness. The answers he was searching for seemed to be right there, within his reach, but still hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed normality. Alice continued to play her role perfectly, smiling at the right moments, keeping her routines intact, but now, to him, everything seemed overly rehearsed. He tried to convince himself that it was just unfounded paranoia, that he was allowing insecurity to consume him for no real reason. But the intuition persisted, insistent like a wound that wouldn't heal. At the office, colleagues noticed that he was quieter, more distracted, less present. Projects that he had previously mastered with ease now seemed to require extra effort, as if his mind was torn between two realities, the one that everyone could see and the one that he felt was unfolding in the shadows. Each night, when he returned home, he watched Alice with an increasingly attentive gaze. Little details jumped out at him, the perfume he now wore more frequently, the clothes he chose for meetings, the way he hung up the phone whenever he approached. He tried not to react, pretended that nothing was different, but the knot in his chest only tightened more and more. Until, one night, while they were having dinner together, Alice mentioned a company event. He spoke naturally, as if it were just another appointment, another corporate formality without any importance. But there was something about the way she said it, the subtle gleam in her eyes, the anticipation in her voice, that made Daniel feel sick to his stomach. He asked if she wanted him to go with her, but Alice, with a gentle smile, explained that it was something more aimed at employees, something he probably wouldn't find interesting. He nodded, pretending to agree, but at that moment something inside him made up his mind. It wasn't just an unfounded suspicion. It wasn't paranoia. There was something going on, and tonight, he would find out. When the day of the event arrived, Alice got ready with care that he hadn't seen in a long time. The dress, tight enough to highlight every curve, the high heels that made her movements more elegant, the enveloping perfume that filled the air. She smiled before leaving, gave him a quick kiss and promised she wouldn't be long. Daniel watched the scene with a fixed gaze, every detail recorded in his mind. He waited patiently until she left, until the car turned the corner, and then he grabbed his keys. He drove slowly, keeping a safe distance. The journey to the event location wasn't long, but at that moment, every second seemed to drag by. When he arrived, he stood outside, watching the guests coming in, laughing, talking. Their eyes scanned the room until, finally, they found what they were looking for. Alice was not alone. There she was, next to a man he vaguely recognized. Coworker. Someone from the company? He didn't know the name, but he saw enough to understand. The way he touched her, subtle but intimate. The way she smiled at him, the way she leaned her body towards his, as if each gesture was an involuntary reflection of the closeness they shared. There was no hesitation, there was no awkwardness. Alice didn't just seem to be accompanied. She seemed to be where she wanted to be. Daniel felt his chest tighten. The confirmation was right in front of him, wide open. His wife didn't just cheat on him, she did it with frightening ease, as if it had been part of his life for a long time. The ground beneath his feet seemed to give way for an instant, as if everything he knew was crumbling at once. He could have gone home. I could have swallowed my anger, waited until I was calmer to decide what to do. But no. It needed to end there. With firm steps, he advanced through the room, ignoring the curious looks of the other guests. His heart was pounding, but his mind was cold, calculating. It took Alice a few seconds to notice him, but when her eyes finally found him, her smile disappeared. The color in her face dissipated, and for an instant, she froze. Daniel stopped in front of her and the man accompanying her. Silence spread around. Alice opened her mouth, trying to say something, but he didn't give her time. Everyone will know who you really are. Your mask will fall off. The words came out sharp, each syllable loaded with the weight of pain, indignation, contained fury. Alice swallowed, her hands shaking. Her lover took a step back, as if seeking a discreet exit to escape the impending disaster. But it was already too late. There, in that room full of curious looks and hushed whispers, the truth finally came out. But what Daniel still didn't know was that betrayal was just the surface of something much bigger. Something he never imagined. Something that was yet to be revealed. The silence was suffocating. The room, once full of laughter and conversation, now became a prison of attentive eyes and restrained breaths. Alice remained motionless, her fingers clenched around the glass of wine that seemed to slip through her trembling hands. The man at his side, pale and tense, avoided Daniel's gaze like a guilty person who fears being condemned even before the trial. But there, at that moment, there was no longer any need for proof. The truth was out in the open, visible to anyone who wanted to see. The betrayal was exposed, naked, defenseless. Alice's eyes wavered for a second, her rapid breathing betraying the panic she was trying to contain. She opened her mouth, but Daniel didn't allow any excuses to be made. The contempt in his eyes was an impossible weight to bear. He didn't need to hear empty justifications, desperate attempts to minimize the inevitable. But Alice was not a weak woman. Even in the face of the truth that crushed him, he struggled to maintain his composure. He tried to compose himself, forcing a tone of voice that should have sounded confident, but which failed to hide the tremor. He said it wasn't what it seemed, that he was exaggerating, that he could explain it. But Daniel laughed, a bitter laugh, filled with disbelief and anger. His patience had long since run out. The entire hall watched them. Conversations had ceased, and the environment seemed like an arena where the confrontation unfolded without filter. Alice looked around, feeling the weight of the exposure. His eyes begged for a corner where he could hide, but there was no refuge. The lover at her side, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, decided to intervene. He tried to say something, tried to soften it, but Daniel turned to him with a cold, direct look. He asked how long it had been happening. I wanted to know if he was just another on the long list or if he had been chosen to replace a marriage that now seemed like a sham. The man hesitated. He looked at Alice, seeking permission to speak, but she remained petrified. Her silence was a greater confession than any words could be. Daniel clenched his fists, anger and pain mixing into a suffocating knot. But deep down, I knew that the betrayal, however painful it was, wasn't the worst part of that story. There was something more. Something that had not yet been revealed. That was when Alice finally broke the silence. He said he needed to talk to him in private, that it wasn't a matter to be resolved there. Daniel laughed again, this time louder, more sarcastic. After all, I still wanted control over the situation. But he was no longer willing to follow the script she wrote. He told me to speak right there, to say it for everyone to hear. If she was brave enough to betray him, she should be brave enough to tell him the truth. Her gaze wavered. His breathing became even more irregular. Daniel realized that something was haunting her besides the fear of being caught. There was guilt, yes, but there was also something deeper. Something that seemed even more devastating than the betrayal itself. Then came the confession. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes watery, her lips trembling. He tried to find a way to soften the impact, but he knew there was no safe way. The truth would be told, and when it was, nothing would be left between them but rubble. Alice took a deep breath and said, at once, that Daniel was not the man he thought he was. That your entire life was built on a lie. That their marriage, the years of dedication, the memories he cherished, were just a facade for a secret she never had the courage to reveal. He felt the ground disappear. The heart was pounding in the chest, the breathing was heavy, the air was rare. He asked her what she meant, but deep down he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Alice looked at him, tears now flowing uncontrollably. She said that, from the beginning, she never loved him the way he deserved. That, before they got married, she was already in a relationship with another man, a relationship that never really ended. That marriage was a convenient choice, a way to maintain a stable life, a perfect facade. That Daniel was always the ideal husband, the man any woman would want, but he was never the man who truly lived in her heart. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel felt the impact like a sharp blow, a punch to the stomach. The years of marriage, the plans, the dreams, everything seemed to crumble before her eyes. It wasn't just a recent betrayal. It wasn't just a momentary slip. It was his entire life being rewritten before him, transformed into something unrecognizable. He wasn't just betrayed now. He was fooled from the start. Their marriage was never real. He was never the first choice. The room revolved around him. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth, a pressure in his chest that prevented him from breathing. Alice kept talking, trying to explain, trying to say that, somehow, despite everything, she had learned to like him, that there were moments when she almost managed to truly love him. But the words were empty. He didn't need any of that. I needed to get out of there. Daniel's gaze met his wife's lover, who was now clearly uncomfortable. He knew everything. He always knew. It was part of the plan, part of the lie. The room, once a space full of acquaintances and colleagues, now looked like a courtroom where Daniel was the only victim. The sound around him became a distant hum, and all he saw was Alice, the woman he loved, the woman he sacrificed so much for, admitting it was all just a grand illusion. He felt a laugh escape, but there was no humor in it. It was a laugh of despair, of disbelief, of someone who realized too late that he lived a life that never belonged to him. And then, without saying anything else, he turned his back and left. He no longer needed answers. The truth was devastating enough. Daniel left the room without looking back. The steps were steady, but his mind seemed stuck in a daze, as if the weight of the truth had not yet been completely absorbed. The night air was cold, but not cold enough to put out the fire burning inside him. He walked to the parking lot without a defined direction, not knowing exactly what to do with the avalanche of emotions that swallowed him inside. His fists were clenched, not in anger, but in desperation. His entire life, all the choices he made, the years he dedicated, all of it was a well-told lie, a farce constructed with meticulous details so that he would never suspect. And he fell. He lived inside that illusion, blind, believing he had a solid marriage, a real life, true love. Now all he was left with was emptiness. He leaned against the car, closing his eyes for a moment, feeling his head throbbing with chaotic thoughts. What were you doing now? How do you start over after such a revelation? How do you face your own reflection in the mirror knowing that you spent years being just a convenient substitute? He took a deep breath, but the air seemed too thick to enter his lungs. That's when he heard hurried footsteps behind him. Alice. She stopped a few meters away, panting, as if she had run to catch up to him. His eyes were red, the tears were flowing uncontrollably, but he no longer saw anything of the woman he once knew. Now all he saw was someone he never really knew. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. She tried to take a step forward, but Daniel raised his hand in a gesture that stopped her. No. Stop. You have nothing more to tell me. She took a deep breath, trying to find some way to rebuild what was destroyed, but the words that came out of her mouth only made everything worse. I never wanted to hurt you, I never wanted it to be like this. He laughed, a short, dry laugh, without any trace of humor. You never wanted to hurt me. Alice, you destroyed me. You broke every piece of my life and now you want to convince me that some part of it was done with good intentions? I was an idiot for a long time, but I'm not anymore. She flinched, feeling the weight of truth in his every word. She tried to get closer, but he took a step back, keeping the necessary distance so as not to be swallowed by the confusion that was being in front of her now. I wanted to love you, I swear. I tried. But he couldn't. Because your heart has always belonged to someone else, hasn't it? I was just a consolation prize. She couldn't deny it. Her silence was the only response Daniel needed. For a moment, a heavy silence fell between the two, only the distant echoes of the party filled the void around them. Alice was sobbing, but there was no compassion left inside him. Just a deep, irreparable pain. It was then that a voice interrupted the moment. Alice? Her lover. Daniel slowly turned around, finding that man standing near the exit of the room. His expression was one of concern, but also of hesitation. He didn't know if he should intervene, if he should get closer or if he should simply disappear from there. Alice looked from one to the other, as if finally realizing how deep she had sunk into her own lie. She wanted to speak, wanted to explain something, but Daniel got ahead of her. That's who you want to be with, isn't it? She was silent. Answer me, Alice. Do you want to be with him? Her eyes were filled with a despair that seemed to have no solution. I don't know, then I answer for you. He turned to his lover, his eyes cold, his voice firm. You can keep it. She was never mine anyway. The man hesitated. I didn't expect that. I didn't expect Daniel to give up so quickly, I didn't expect to see Alice so fragile, so lost. He had always held her in his arms, but now he realized that perhaps she had never been completely his either. Alice collapsed, covering her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. But Daniel didn't move. There was nothing left there for him. There was nothing more to say. He turned around, opened the car door and got in, without looking back. The sound of the engine starting was the only farewell he offered before accelerating and disappearing down the road. The city blurred before his eyes, but he saw nothing. Just the echo of her words repeating in his mind. I tried to love you. But he couldn't. The night stretched on, and he drove aimlessly. I just wanted to get away. I just wanted to forget. But he knew that, no matter how hard he tried, he would never be able to erase what was now engraved in every fiber of his existence. The road stretched out in front of him like an endless tunnel, streetlights flashing by in intermittent flashes that seemed to reflect the chaos within. The silence inside the car was deafening, filled only by the sound of the engine and your own heavy breathing. Alice's words still echoed, spinning uncontrollably in her mind, each syllable heavy with the weight of betrayal and lost time. It wasn't just the pain of having been betrayed that consumed him, but the fact that he had lived an entire life without realizing that he was just an extra in his own story. He wondered how many decisions he made believing he had a partner by his side when, in fact, he was always alone. The digital panel blinked, indicating that it was already past midnight. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he couldn't go home. The thought of walking through that door, of seeing the objects that once held happy memories now transformed into reminders of a farce, was unbearable. He didn't want to feel her scent permeating the furniture, he didn't want to lie in the bed where he so often believed he was safe, supported by a love that never existed. His own home had become a minefield, filled with memories that now only hurt. Without realizing it, he turned onto a country road and drove for miles, thoughts weighing on him like a storm about to break. The anger was beginning to give way to an overwhelming exhaustion, a tiredness that was not just physical, but emotional. He felt drained, as if years of life had been ripped from him in one fell swoop. He parked at an almost deserted gas station, turning off the engine and letting his head fall onto the steering wheel. He took a deep breath, trying to organize the whirlwind of feelings inside him. But how to organize something that was in ruins? He picked up his cell phone, not knowing exactly what he was looking for. He opened the gallery, and there were the photos. Birthdays, trips, moments that seemed so genuine before. Alice smiled beside him, her eyes shining with happiness. Or at least that's what he thought. Now everything I saw was a lie. Could it be that, in the moments when he believed they were happy, she was already with someone else? Could it be that, when she kissed him, she was already thinking about someone other than him? How do you rebuild an identity when everything you believe to be real falls apart before your eyes? Suddenly, the cell phone screen lit up with a call. Alice. He watched her name flash for a few seconds before rejecting the call. I didn't want to hear your voice. I didn't want explanations, excuses or empty promises. But she insisted. He called again. Then once more. Then came the messages. Please talk to me, I know nothing I say will fix this, but you need to listen to me. I never wanted it to end like this. He threw his cell phone on the passenger seat, taking a deep breath, trying to ignore the almost masochistic urge to respond. What was there to say? He had already heard everything he needed. The betrayal was already written into his skin, burning every piece of who he was. There was no more room for dialogue. He decided to get out of the car to breathe a little, feeling the cold early morning wind hit his face. The gas station's parking lot was almost empty, except for a truck driver who was filling up his vehicle and a woman who was getting out of a car to buy something at the convenience store. His eyes were lost for a moment on the road ahead, the asphalt lit only by the scattered lights of the streetlights. For the first time in years, he realized he didn't have a destiny. I didn't have a plan. His life, once so organized, so meticulously structured, was now an unknown. He went back to the car and picked up his cell phone, but instead of answering Alice, he opened his calendar and started scrolling through his contacts. Who could he call? Who could understand what he was going through? He was always a reserved man, someone who solved his problems alone, but at that moment he felt an unbearable weight. Stopped at a familiar name. A longtime friend, someone who was always around but with whom he never had a deeper connection. However, at that moment, she seemed to be the only person he could call without feeling even deeper. He hesitated for a few seconds, but before he could question himself too much, he pressed the call button. Her voice answered after a few rings, drowsy but immediately concerned upon hearing her tone. He asked if he was okay, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. How does one answer this question when everything around is falling apart? He did not give details. I just said I needed to talk. He asked if she could meet him. There was silence on the other end of the line, but soon after came the answer. Yes. As he drove to the agreed location, his mind was still struggling to process everything. How do you move forward when the ground you were walking on simply disappears? He didn't know. But somehow, he would have to find out. Daniel's car slid down the dark road, the headlights illuminating just a few meters ahead, as if the future was an unknown that was revealed little by little. He drove without thinking, letting his hands grip the steering wheel automatically, while his mind wandered through a maze of memories, of words said and unsaid, of everything that was and never really was. With each kilometer covered, the anger dissipated, giving way to something deeper, more devastating, an emptiness. An immense hole that seemed to suck away all the certainty he once had. When he arrived at the cafe where he agreed to meet Leah, he parked without rushing, allowing himself a few seconds to breathe. It was strange being there, in that small, silent place, so far from everything I was used to. At this time, few people were in the place, and the space was lit by yellowish lamps that cast soft shadows on the wooden tables. He entered and found Leah sitting in a discreet corner, a cup of coffee in front of her and a look full of concern. She looked up as he approached, studying his face for a few seconds before saying anything. There was a softness in her expression, a silent understanding that dispensed with obvious questions. He sat across from her, not knowing exactly where to start. Leah broke the silence first, her voice low but firm. He asked if he wanted to talk about what had happened, and for a moment, Daniel felt like he couldn't. There were so many things trapped inside him, a mess of emotions that seemed impossible to organize into words. But then he looked at her, at the patience in her eyes, at the way her fingers slowly turned the handle of the cup, and something inside him gave way. He said his life was a lie. That everything he built, everything he believed in, crumbled before his eyes. That, for years, he lived next to a woman who never truly loved him, who never chose him, and who now, he didn't know who he was without this story he spent so long telling himself. Leah listened without interrupting. I just watched, absorbed every word, letting him release everything that was suffocating him. When he finished, he took a deep breath, as if he was trying to catch his breath after a deep dive. She tilted her head, her eyes fixed on his, and said she understood. That no one is prepared to find out that their story wasn't real. But that didn't mean his life was over. He laughed, a short, humorless laugh. Asked how to move on when everything you knew was a lie. How to trust anything again. How can you believe in love after having been used, betrayed, deceived? Leah sighed, stirring her coffee, as if searching for the right words. He said that no one can avoid the pain of loss, but that what defines a person is not what was done to them, but what they choose to do afterwards. That he could spend the rest of his life dwelling on what happened, becoming consumed with anger and disappointment, or he could use it to rebuild himself. To find something new, something true. He looked at her, looking for signs that this was just a rehearsed speech, but all he found was sincerity. That was what made him trust her. Leah didn't try to convince him that everything would be fine, she didn't offer empty promises. He just told the truth. For a few minutes, they were silent. The coffee was getting cold in the cups, the dawn was advancing, and Daniel felt that, for the first time in a long time, someone really saw him. Not as a betrayed husband, not as a broken man, but as someone who still had something to offer the world. When he finally left the cafe, he felt that something inside him had changed. The heaviness was still there, but now, there was a small sliver of light. A thought that once seemed impossible began to slowly form in his mind. Maybe he could start over. The months passed in a blur, and the pain that was once unbearable began to transform into something different. Daniel wouldn't forget, he wouldn't get over it overnight, but he learned to live with the wound without allowing it to define him. After the betrayal was exposed, Alice tried to contact him countless times, sending messages, calling, even showing up in places where she knew he could be. But he never responded. There was no more room for your voice in his life. The divorce was initiated without arguments, without requests for reconciliation, without any trace of the manipulative woman he knew. It seemed that, upon realizing that she had truly lost him, she simply accepted the destiny she created for herself. She tried to move on with her life with the man she threw everything away for, but reality hit her like an inevitable blow. There was no longer any respect between them. The lover, previously enchanted by the challenge of conquering a married woman, no longer saw her with the same intensity now that she was available. What was once an exciting adventure has become something mundane. Betrayal brought them together, but it was also the fragile foundation on which they tried to build something. Before long, arguments began, insecurity grew, and what was left between them was just an uncomfortable void. Alice began to realize that the man she sacrificed her marriage for could never give her what Daniel gave her. He wasn't patient, he wasn't loyal, he wasn't safe. And when she finally understood this, it was already too late. Daniel, on the other hand, refused to be destroyed by grief. He dedicated himself to his work, found new routines, learned to listen to himself again. And, in the middle of this process, he began to notice that Leah was always around. Not in a forced way, not as someone trying to fill an empty space, but as someone who was simply there when he needed them. At first, it was difficult for him to understand that there could be something beyond pain, that there could be a new beginning without it feeling like a betrayal of himself. But, little by little, the meetings became more frequent, the conversations deeper, the moments together more natural. And before he realized it, Daniel wasn't just surviving. He was living. The day she signed the divorce papers was the day she completely freed herself. Alice was present, but there were no tears, no pleas. Just a silence that said more than any words. She left the room before him, without looking back, carrying with her the weight of her own choices. Daniel, in turn, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, relief. Each person's destiny was sealed according to the choices they made. Alice lost everything she thought she had secured, and the lover who was once her escape became just another mistake she would regret. Daniel, on the other hand, found in himself the strength he never knew he had, and alongside Leah, he began to see the future with new eyes. And so, the chapters of this story came to an end, but not without leaving scars, not without leaving lessons. Some people destroy everything they have without realizing its value until it's too late. Others learn to start over even when everything seems lost. Now I want to know what you thought of this story. Comment below what your favorite part was and what lesson you learned from this plot. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now for more stories like this. Here, we make it clear that we do not support any type of betrayal, because in the end, the truth always comes out and the consequences are inevitable. See you in the next story.